So if you're a brand, an entrepreneur, an inventor, and you have a product, figure out why somebody's going to buy it. Ignore where it's made, why it's made, what it's made out of initially, and make sure that it's a good product fit. Then once you know that you've got a product that people want, then it's your responsibility, in my opinion, to find the best way to produce it that provides the least amount of impact in the world.
Hey, Ryan, welcome to the Manufacturing Report podcast.
Hello, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Of course. I'm really excited to share the story of Shloop with our listeners. And I know there's a lot to tell, but I want to start by getting to know you. And so before you came to Shloop with your co-founder, Ryan, what was your journey?
Really, for me, in college, I was studying physics and bioengineering. I've been really fascinated with sustainability, with renewable energy, and I also happen to have a love for aquariums and fish tanks. And in college, I had, at the end of it, 5 different saltwater marine aquariums. And these fish tanks eventually started having algae blooms in them. Cleaned the tanks up, and then a day later they were back. And I just got really fascinated with how fast the algae could grow. And so I did some research online, and I found that the US government had spent over 20 years researching algae as a biofuel alternative to gasoline. And so that kind of started my interest in sustainable materials and renewable energy. And so I ended up applying to grad school at the University of Georgia to pursue a graduate degree in biorefining and biological engineering. And so my very first project was turning pine trees into crude oil. And then that evolved to turning algae into crude oil, and then turning algae into other things like feeds, fuels, fibers, and ultimately polymers.
Okay, so I have to ask you a question here, and you're talking to a layperson scientifically. How in the world does one get from algae to basically a combustible fuel that one can utilize? I'm really curious about this.
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 different fundamental pathways. One, the most common one, was that algae, like other plants such as soybeans or peanuts, they contain oils, and oils can be converted into essentially a diesel-like fuel called biodiesel. And that process is called transesterification. You also can go a different route called thermochemical conversion, where heat and pressure is applied to the algae to convert it, much like the earth does with ancient biomass, into crude oil. The biomass is broken down under inert environment, and what comes out of the process is a bio-based crude oil. So that crude oil can be refined and turned into diesel or gasoline or other materials. With our group, we were looking at not just fuels, but also what to do with the byproducts. So when you extract the oil out, you're left with a residue that's predominantly comprised of proteins and carbohydrates and minerals. And so we were looking at ways to turn those other fractions into animal feeds, fertilizer, or even materials. And so that was really where my work kicked off in the commercial world, which was that after we did all this research on converting algae into biofuels, we realized that most of the algae that is grown in the world in these things called algae blooms, these fast, rapid growing explosions of algae biomass that occur due to excess nutrients, CO2, nitrogen, and phosphorus. That can be the result of wastewater, runoff, pollution. The algae responds to these nutrients just like plants do. Algae is just a single cell plant, and it converts it very rapidly into biomass. And so when we started looking at what the best route for converting biomass into value was, we found that while we could produce a fuel is tough. It's very high, very low margin, very high volume. So you got to produce a whole lot of it, and you got to produce it very cheaply to be competitive. And that's not conducive for startups. So we started looking at, well, what's the opposite of that? What can we produce at smaller volumes that can generate higher value and higher margin? And that's when we started focusing on materials and polymers.
Let's talk about your startup for a second, because I was curious about that route as well. Like, what is the commercial market like for developing these novel or new uses of the algae, byproducts and what have you? Is it something where, say, there are large energy companies working on this, or is there a vibrant startup community? I'm just curious as to your path from the academic to the commercial aspect of this, Ryan.
Sure. Well, that was 15 years ago. And at that time,
Okay.
yes, there was startup companies, lots of startup companies trying to come up with creative ways to produce the algae, to modify the algae, to extract the algae. There was also large oil companies that were involved. All the big names had some sort of biofuel or algae program at that time. And that went on for the course of about 5 to 8 years. There was federal funding, Department of Energy funding for pilot plants and innovation and technology development. So that was a time in the world where this is really before electric cars. This was in 2007, 2008, 2009.
Sure.
So, that was just in the very, very beginnings of Tesla, for instance. And so for what we saw and when we saw the market moving, we knew that we weren't going to be able to be competitive out the gate with a fuel product. It was going to take a serious amount of investment. And some companies did raise over $500 million. Ultimately, billions of dollars were invested into this between, I'd say, 2007 and 2015. Most of those programs ended up ultimately failing or closing or lost funding. And the main reason was that it's just too hard to scale and be competitive with traditional oil. There's a 100-year head start with petroleum that's hard to compete with. And without the subsidies, without the grants, getting to scale was very challenging. And then compounded with that, being able to have the distribution and then the advent of electric cars, electrification, the whole automotive industry shifted away from biofuels and has been focused on electrification. So luckily, I kind of saw the writing on the wall even as early as 2008. I was following Tesla in the early days before they even released their Roadster, and saw that if that was successful, then we're not going to need biofuels. We're going to need batteries.
Yeah.
And so that early foresight was helpful for us. That pushed us into a different direction, looking at materials. You can't make materials out of electricity alone. You still need building blocks of carbon and mass and biomass to be able to do that. And so polymers are very similar to oil in the sense that most polymers are made from oil. These are polymer chains of carbon. And so with algae, it comprises a large concentration of these biomaterials in the biomass. Proteins, for example, are just polymer chains of amino acids. So the natural biomass had these polymeric properties. And so we started looking at how do we exhibit or how do we convert and improve the properties of that biomass to a point where it can be used in traditional consumer products. And that was always our goal, is how do we use algae to replace, oil or petroleum-based products in the finished good. And so that was the start of it. We founded that company in 2010. It was called Algae. And still around. We've scaled that up from a laboratory experiment at the lab bench at University of Georgia. Now that we later spun that off into a startup company in 2010, where we built our own laboratory there in Athens. And after 4 years of developing recipes, developing new compounds, getting these materials into the hands of innovators and companies and converters, we decided that it was time to scale up. And in 2014, we built a factory in Mississippi where we could produce these compounds at industrial scale. So milling, compounding, and packaging of the pellets. And by 2017, we signed our first big deal with Adidas and several other footwear companies. So that was really a pivotal moment for us, where we identified a market, which was the footwear industry and the consumer product industry, that had a desire to be more sustainable and had a material, a product that was comprised of a polymer that was compatible with the algae. And we began scaling up not just the production, but now the distribution and onboarding the shoe factories. And one of the big revelations that we had during that process was that the vast majority of all the shoe companies in the world they don't really make anything. They design, they develop, and they market, but they're not really the ones creating the product or even really doing the final engineering on it. Most of this is done by the factories themselves. And these factories are independently owned and operated, typically Chinese or Vietnamese factories or factories in other countries owned by the Chinese or even Taiwanese. So it's a very Asian centric supply chain. And so we began having to essentially work within that framework. So we started shipping our product to Asia, working with these factories, spending a lot of time in Asia at these factories. We ended up having to hire a staff of technical and supply chain experts that were Chinese nationals that lived in China and worked with the factories that were producing footwear for all the footwear brands. And so that was a bit of a wake up call, because I never realized how dependent we were on a couple cities, really. I mean, there's like two cities in China that do all of this. So, I mean, these are very, very large cities with very large populations, but that's where it's all happening at. And so some of that has migrated into Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh more recently over the past maybe 5 years. But even so, China's still the majority force of this. And so when we started having to ship our products there, we ran into some problems. This was 2017, 2018. That was the beginning of the first Trump administration and the trade wars. The first round of trade tariffs were implemented. So we were now being tariffed. Our products being made in the USA were being tariffed into China. And those Chinese made products that were being converted to finished shoes were being tariffed as a made in China product going back into the USA for our customers. So we were at least being double tariffed in many cases, plus the duties, the VAT, and the shipping both ways. So cost became a really big problem. And COVID really did a number on the whole supply chain. It shut down, as everybody knows, it shut down everything. And huge problems. It jacked up the cost of shipping. It jacked up the cost of raw materials and inflation. So what was already kind of a bad situation with just general trade, shipping, and tariffs now was even amplified further with this extra layer of inflation and logistical expense. And so in 2021, we started looking at ways to diversify outside of China. And that was where Shloop was born.
Oh, interesting. So let me, I want to move on to Shloop in a second, but I wanted to just rewind for a couple of questions. One is a very basic one for our listeners. Which part of the shoe are you talking about when you're talking about the polymers that you're creating?
So our polymer is called Bloom, and the Bloom is an EVA blend. And EVA is a type of polymer that's kind of rubbery, and it can be used primarily in the foam or the outsole. So you typically find it in what's called the insole of the shoe, or the sock liner that kind of slips out of the shoe. It's the foam that goes inside the shoe. Sometimes there'll be what's called a midsole, which is the foam. That's the mid part of the shoe. It's a little bit harder, a little bit firmer, but still a foam.
Right.
And then you also can have what's called a ground contact approved EVA, which is a outsole material that can actually be the tread or the sole of the shoe that touches the ground.
Okay. That's super helpful. And then going back even a little further with respect to the shoe companies, is this something that these companies who are very large and global and have R&D budgets, right? Want to pay attention to sustainability and have other goals like that. Were they reaching out saying, give us some ideas here? Or was this something that you and your colleagues were able to pitch to say, this is going to meet a need that you have? How did that process?
This was a pitch. Yeah. We started, our first brand was actually a brand called Vivo Barefoot out of Britain, out of UK.
Okay.
And they do barefoot shoes, and, they're a smaller brand. The big brands are hard, right? Like they're very, we were lucky to get Adidas, as they're called in Germany. They're very innovative and they're more forward thinking compared to some of the other big brands. So, but any of these big brands, it's hard, it's tough. There's a lot of decision makers. It's very complicated. It's a giant cruise ship that you've got to try to shift, and it's not so easy. So smaller brands have been the earlier targets, and those are the ones that you can get traction with. You can talk to the CEO. They can make a decision and then make things happen. Whereas with big organizations, it's hard to navigate your way through that network of connections and decision makers in those companies.
So you get to the point after the tariffs and after COVID that you're basically like the total cost of ownership has leveled out somewhat, depending on, or having some production in the United States. So as you know, I don't have to tell you, the number of shoemakers in the United States is small. It's a village. It's not a city, as you said in China, where there's actual cities that are set up to do all of this stuff. You could probably put everybody who works in the shoe industry in Meridian, Mississippi, and their employees and everybody else.
Yeah, multiple Meridian, Mississippis. Yeah.
Really? Yeah. How did you do that? Because there just is not there's not the ecosystem like there is in China or Vietnam. So let's talk about, you're like, okay, let's do a factory in the United States. What, pick it up from there.
So, we just knew that what was happening in China wasn't sustainable in a couple of ways. One was just from the business perspective, from our business perspective, we kept losing projects. We were starting going the wrong direction. We were going up. And then COVID, we had a lot of interest, and then the cost of everything skyrocketed. And then the demand, I don't say the demand was high, but the execution was low.
Yeah. Okay.
So meaning that, it was just challenging to be able to convert and get the product. Takes 2 years typically to get a shoe from design to production and commercialization. Most people think this is an easy thing. It's not. Like, footwear is incredibly challenging. It's one of the most challenging products. It doesn't seem like it would be that hard. We were shocked. We underestimated the complexity, for sure, in the variables, the materials, the technology, the fit. There's just so many vendors. There's so many different, there's the pattern making, the sewing, there's so much labor in it as well. So it's not like you can just automate this thing and put robots in there and crank out shoes automatically. It's like you need people. You need people that know what they're doing. You need designers that can make good looking products. You need materials that are going to perform and last and hold together and bond and glue and have the rebound and the compression sets and all these densities and all these material properties that meet the needs of the brand and meet the needs of the consumer. And so when you add all this stuff together, it's incredibly complex. And that's the reason it takes so long and it's so expensive to launch a shoe. Typically they say that's at least $1 million and in 2 years, 18 months to 24 months to launch a shoe successfully. And that's if you have a good product. You might blow all that money and have a product that nobody wants to buy as well. So that part of it was, we didn't maybe fully realize how complicated it was going to be when we first started. But we also knew that we were an island. We didn't have resources here in Mississippi for footwear. There's no shoemakers. There's no industry. There's no sole makers. There's no sewing industry. The one area that we actually did have there was furniture.
Yeah.
And so
right.
So as we starting the plan, we spent about a year just building out the business plan, starting making the calls, making the connections, having the conference calls with people, customers, suppliers, vendors, just the whole 9 yards, looking at every aspect of it, trying to build how is this all going to work? Identifying the technologies. And there's two things that we found. One was that we needed a way to produce our own soles and have those soles at the factory. And we wanted to be able to have the factory be a Bloom approved factory such that any of the EVA style products, the foam, the rubber, the cup soles, any of the traditional products we would produce through our existing Bloom network. And we tried to move out of China out of this. We said, okay, let's not depend on Asia because who knows what's going to happen. Let's try to and if we're going to launch this again, let's try to go to the best. Let's use the best shoemakers, the best materials, the best compounders, the best molders. And when we did our research, the name that just kept coming up was Italy. Italy has the longest history of high-end shoemaking, the best designers, the best leather, the best soles, the best brands in the world. So we went to Italy. In the first year and a half, we worked with Italian factories on providing us leather and cup soles using bloom and importing that in. And then from that, with that raw material, we hired our own designers and developers, and we were able to develop kind of the simplest shoe possible. We also knew that's the bottom of the shoe. Then there's the top of the shoe. How do you make the top of the shoe? That was the part we didn't have as much experience in that. We knew more about the soles. That part was more straightforward. We'd been working on that for years by this point. The upper of the shoe is actually been more complicated. It's not quite as simple as just injection molding a part or cutting and buffing something. You have patterns, you have a last, you have multi-materials. So we invested in 3 routes. One was we actually invested in automated knitting machines that did 3D knitting, very advanced technology that could knit an entire shoe upper in one piece without the need of a human doing additional processes on the shoe. Yeah. Simple shoes, but fully completed out the machine. 2 was we started working with suppliers in other countries to provide us uppers and ship them to us, import basically just the upper without anything else. And 3 was we wanted to start cutting and sewing our own shoes and making a more premium product that's made out of leather and more traditional footwear product line. And so when we looked at our first product, we knew at small scale we needed a premium product price point. The product had to be at least $200 just to make the economics work. And so if we were going to release a really cheap, low cost, athletic kind of casual sneaker, how are we going to charge big money for that? It needed to be something that was premium. So that's when we kind of lucked out. We came across the sewing department manager of our local furniture factory. I'm not going to mention the name, but let's just say that some people might think they're kind of lazy and boys. But they moved their production out of Mississippi to Mexico. Mm-hmm. And
I remember that. Yeah.
And then there was basically an opportunity to hire the sewing staff and retrain them in the art of shoemaking, which was phenomenal. And they already had the skills of running sewing machines and the mechanics and the operations and the techniques. They just had to really fine tune that into footwear. And so that was a 1.5, now almost 2 years in the making of training our staff. And we hired over a dozen of these ladies to help us, and started with just 2 and then went to 4 and then to 6. And then, now we're at over a dozen. And so they've allowed us to be able to cut and sew full leather shoes that you might find in an Italian, or a normal shoe factory, not just something that's knitted all in one piece. So that gave us some flexibility, the type of products that we could produce. And that allowed us to produce the top of the shoe, the upper of the shoe. And then we just had to assemble it together. So the last step was, once we could mold our own technology using new technologies like our 3D TI technology. This is a collaboration with a technology firm out of Netherlands and us, to create a platform for low cost, high speed, all natural, plant-based shoe cushioning systems. Your insoles, your midsoles, your outsoles of the shoes. We blend that with, or depending on the product, we might use bloom or we might use the other system. So it kind of depends on what kind of product we're making. Then we take the upper of the shoe, either knit or leather. And now we had a pretty interesting platform. We could produce a wide range of shoes, from sneakers, slip-ons, sandals, slippers, boots. We could do a whole range of different products, and we would make those out of, our goal is made in USA materials, sustainable materials, natural materials, recycled materials, and then assemble or produce the whole thing here. And as we scale, if we can't meet the full need, the full demand, or the cost is, let's say the cost parameters are too low for us to do internally, also established a support network of factories in Mexico that could help us scale projects once they get kind of beyond our current capabilities.
Wow, that's quite a journey. It's serendipity that there was a fairly local workforce that wasn't totally, because there's not a lot of shoemakers in this country, right? But someone that had transferable skills who was local. I guess that was very fortunate to be able to find that. So you've got this going, you hired the workers, you're in production. How, Ryan, is Shloop meeting its customers now? Are you Are you exclusively online? Are you trying to get some retail partnerships? Like what is your strategy there?
Yeah, well, that's evolved a bit. I mean, when we first started, the goal was to service our existing customer base, which were the brands.
Yeah, sure.
And that was why we were doing this. We knew they were having problems with their supply chain. We felt it. We knew about it. We knew there was issues getting Bloom scaled up and getting better adoption. So the idea of supporting those customers here domestically, and cutting out a lot of the cost, the tariffs, the
Mhm.
duties, the
Yep.
shipping.
Right.
There's a lot of fees and costs that can be pulled out if you do it locally.
Mhm.
We weren't expecting necessarily the most recent kind of political turn with the tariffs. I mean, it's kind of doubled down.
Yeah.
Like we just knew the fundamentals were questionable, and we needed to
Yeah, I
focus
think
on
more are coming. Right. Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
coming. And so the number one thing you can do for sustainability is to make things locally.
Correct.
By making it
Yep.
locally and using a clean power grid like we have down here in Mississippi, that's primarily natural gas based and renewable based. We have a much lower carbon footprint per kilowatt hour than China, which is mostly still coal based.
Mhm.
And we don't have all the shipping. For companies that are doing more innovation, doing more sustainability, that would be important to them. Also, since we're in the US, we're easy to visit, we're easy to call, we're easy to talk to. We are, held by the same laws around intellectual property as the brands are themselves. So we tend to be more trustworthy in that regard. So for those elements, we felt that we had a very strong value proposition to the brands. The problem has been that to get started, we're a new factory. We've never made
Yeah.
shoes before. And we had a hard time getting a brand to really sign on with us and to be the first guinea pig. And we didn't want to take money from the brands either, because then that meant that we were beholden to their brand, to their product, to them. And we wanted to provide this
Understood.
sustainability
Yeah.
as a service to different brands, not just one client. And so what we ended up doing was creating our own in-house internal brand called Black Swan. And a Black Swan is a term that's known as an event that really changes our perspective on the world. And so COVID for us was a massive Black Swan event. It really exposed a lot of the problems with our supply chain. And so we've named our brand Black Swan kind of after that concept, and been trying to provide a positive response to that, to where, in retrospect, a Black Swan event is like kind of obvious. Like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have sole sourced all of our production to one country on the other side of the world. That doesn't sound that smart in retrospect, if there's a global pandemic or supply chain disruption or war or whatever. So likewise, in the future, our hope is that people look back and say, yeah, making shoes back home again, that makes a lot of sense. That seems kind of obvious now. But at the time, it wasn't happening. There's only a handful of factories in the whole country left. And so with Black Swan, our mission was to prove out our factory, commission the equipment, start training our people, understand what our cost structure is, understand what our capacity is. We can't do that if we don't have something to make. So the Black Swan goal was, let's make a real shoe that is like, lots of parts cut and sewn. I mean, a legitimate real shoe, not a 3D printed. You see a lot of brands now that are doing some of these cool innovations, and they're 3D printing the shoes. That's cool. It's amazing. It's really cool. It's neat. But at this point, they're a little bit more like art projects that you can wear than they are like traditional footwear. Maybe that'll change, but as of right now, we decided let's actually make real shoes that are made in the traditional way, and so that way we can become real shoemakers and build the confidence from our customers, the brands out there in the world, that we are a legitimate factory that can deliver a legitimate product that is a actual footwear product. So that's where it started. And we have taken that over the past year from some prototypes all the way up to a whole collection or multiple collections of low top and high top men's and women's leather and suede, nubuck, full grain sneakers. We've also done some eco materials with recycled leathers, cactus leathers, other types of mushroom leathers, all these other materials that are coming online. So we now have a basic platform that we can private label for a brand. So if you're a brand and you want to make your own line of classic Italian style upsole sneakers, you can come to us and we can put your logo on an existing platform, and we can put, laser engrave it on the sole. We can print it on the side. We can emboss it or deboss it. There's many ways that we can embellish the shoe to have another brand's logo on it. And then we opened our own channels. So we opened up over a dozen wholesale channels in the state of Mississippi, working with independent boutique retailers, selling our brand, selling our products, as well as our own website, our e-commerce website, blackswanfootwear.com. It's BLKSWN. So there's no vowels. It's BLKSWN footwear.com. And then that's our website. You can go and see what we have. We update that periodically as we get new products on new colorways online. And then most recently, we've just opened our own retail brick and mortar store ourselves that's located in our tower of our factory. So our building that we bought for the shoe factory is actually a bakery from the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
And so our lobby is a 40-foot tall, 45-foot tall tower that was called the Flour Tower. This was where they stored the flour to make the bread.
Yeah.
So the Flour Tower, the silos have been since removed many, many decades ago, but it was just this massive room. So we've gone in and totally turned that room into a showroom and a retail room where customers can come into the factory. They can see all the products that we make. They can shop. They can try stuff on. They can buy it from us directly. And they can even a factory tour. They can peek into the factory. We got a big window door. You can look in and see everything. And during certain periods, to certain days, certain times, and certain pre-scheduled events, we can actually give detailed factory tours to show meet the people, the equipment, the process. You can see the whole thing, how the shoes are made, and which is very, very unusual. That no one really gets to see that usually.
Yeah, not at all. So you're at the cusp of something really extraordinary. It sounds like, Ryan. I wonder, as we're wrapping up, just a couple of things, because we do get, we get a lot of inquiries from folks who say, you know what, I have this idea for a product and, I want to figure out how to make it in the United States. And there's no manual on how to do this. You well know that. You've been through this. But I'm wondering, and I know that you guys are still early in the process, relatively early in the process, but is there something that you wish you had known when you started this that is some solid advice that you can pass along to other folks who are thinking about launching products in the United States?
Yeah. Many thoughts come to mind. One would be that it's all about the manufacturing, and building the factory is way harder than building the product. Is way more expensive. So, but then if you do build a product or you build a factory, we kind of did it all backwards, which, isn't always, I don't recommend doing it the way that we did it. So, I don't know how else we would have done it, but at the end of the day, you got to identify your market and your customer and know that your product is going to sell. So the sooner you can get pre-orders or customer feedback, obviously the better. I guess that seems kind of obvious, but, finding a trustworthy factory that can help you develop your product and get that into the hands of your consumer as early as you possibly can to make those changes, make the tweaks, identify what that persona is. The area that we're not experts in the sales and marketing side, but as our business evolved and we ultimately became a brand, really not out of our internal desire, but just out of necessity, to be able to prove that we could become shoemakers and build a functional shoe factory, we now got thrust into this sales and marketing and branding and advertising and social media. That became a requirement. So, we weren't really prepared for that. We're not really funded for that. And, our hope was that, okay, well, let's just keep growing organically. Let's start small. Let's get out there. Let's create some social channels. Let's get the word out. Unlocking that part of it is really hard. And whether that's a budget item thing or finding the right influencers or you're just getting lucky and going viral, which, is hard to do these days, being on the right platform. I think that the old guard of Facebook and Instagram, while, those were great 5-10 years ago, TikTok and others these days are where most of the, viewers are at. And certainly being able to get your message out without being throttled back with the algorithms seems like it's a little bit better on the newer platforms. But regardless, it's like, who are you going after? For us, it was weird. Sustainability, people love the idea. No one wants to pay more for it, including the brands. So, especially when things are going up, when inflation's going up. So like you got to have a real value proposition besides just
Absolutely.
it's better for the world, because that's great. But what's it do for what does it do for me?
Right.
What does it do for you? Right. The product looked amazing. It's a nice thing to have. It's a nice little accent, but it's never what you got to lead with. We've learned that the hard way, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't that way. We thought that people would just buy stuff because it's more sustainable or whatever, but it doesn't seem to be the case necessarily, at least not with the demographic that we've been connecting with.
Yeah, you need an and there as well. So
and that's where the Made in USA comes from. The Made in USA is very good. And but also again, it's like that's more, I would say, baby boomer or a little bit like Gen X or newer is more interested in domestic sourcing. The younger, from at least from the surveys that we've done, the Gen Zs care less about the made in America. They care more about sustainability, and vice versa on the baby boomer side.
Yeah. So you just have to find a way to blend that together.
You always have like two different messagings that going out there. If you're trying to talk to the Made in USA, well, you need to target a different clientele. If you're going to talk about sustainability, you need to target a younger clientele. But then at the end of the day, what does the shoe look like? What outfit does it go in? Is it the most comfortable shoe they've ever put on their feet? How durable is it?
That's right.
How does it give them bunions? Does it give them blisters? Does it how long can they walk and not have foot pain? So like all those things.
Yeah.
Oh, so those are honestly the performance of it. Kind of is the number one. I hate to say it, but that's really what the key thing. So if you're a brand and if you're an entrepreneur or an inventor and you have a product, figure out why somebody's going to buy it. Ignore where it's made, why it's made, what it's made out of initially, and make sure that it's a good product fit. Then once you know that you've got a product that people want, then it's your responsibility, in my opinion, to find the best way to produce it that provides the least amount of impact in the world.
And I think we see a couple right above your hat too, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
These are our, absolutely. Yeah, there's the balloon pellets are here. That's the resin pellets from algae. And then these are some of our shoes that we produced. I can show them to you.
Yeah.
So here's the pellets.
Wow. Okay.
Just get blended into a foam, and then that's what is used to make the shoe.
Wow. That's extraordinary. So, well, Ryan Hunt, thank you so much for explaining the process, explaining the journey. Congratulations to you, your founder, your team on really an extraordinary product. Super happy that it's manufactured in Meridian, Mississippi, and very grateful for the time and expertise that you brought for us today on the manufacturing report.
Thank you, Scott. Any footwear makers out there, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help grow the network, expand the community, and get more people, more companies making products here in the U.S.